Hi everyone. In this video I will summarize the second half of our class that we've done, which basically everything since the midterm. So there are 4 chapters that we covered, and here you get to see basically the key subsections in each of these 4 chapters. Now if you go through the material, you'll see that there's a lot of graphs, and there's several problems that can be asked that require these graphs in order to solve them. You've had to do some of them for homework, but there are a few more. Now, the issue is that there's so many graphs that if you don't really understand the key principles that govern these graphs, they can all become confusing, and you're not sure which graph the question is really referring to. So in order to help you with this, I created basically a set of ideas to help you understand the key principles that basically determine how these graphs are built. So rather than memorizing a lot of graphs, you can actually build them yourself by just paying attention to keywords in the questions. At the end of this set of slides, you'll find a few problems. I can also solve some of those problems for you. You can ask me individually which problems you'd like me to solve. And I'll also do a video like this for some of the other sections, depending on what you guys would like me to do. Over the next 2 classes, I can receive a lot more feedback and learn more about what are the videos that you guys want me to make. So here, there are 4 key principal words that you need to pay attention to. You need to pay attention to the policy instrument that's being used, the sector that this policy instrument affects, the size of the country, and the market structure. Okay? So if you pay attention to these, each one of these key words will help you understand how the graphs basically need to be built. In some questions, you might need just one graph of the home country, but for some questions, you may need both the home country and the world graph in order to be able to clearly explain and answer the question. So there are 3 policy instruments: tariffs, quotas, and subsidies. When we look at what a policy instrument does, the whole idea is we look at changes in welfare. So the first thing that you need to make sure that you understand well is how we measure welfare through surplus of consumers, of producers, and of government revenue. Tariffs shift the world price up and down usually. Quotas lead to horizontal shifts in the home supply, and they also appear as a vertical line in the world graph. And subsidies basically are kind of like opposite to tariffs. They move world prices up and down, or home prices. When we think about imports, tariffs on imports, it's important to realize, the first thing we got to realize is if a country is importing, that means that their price of the world has to be below the price at home. And the price at home is the interaction of supply and demand. So whenever you think of imports, the price of the world is always below the intersection of supply and demand. Whenever you think of exports, the price of the world is always above the price at home. So this is very important. When we think about the size of the country, it's either that a country is small and that it does not affect world prices, in which case, if we think about an exporting country, then that means the imports of the world is flat. If we think about an importing country, the world exports is flat. On the other hand, if we think about a large country, because it influences world prices, and it's such a big country that when it shifts or when it changes how much it imports or exports from the rest of the world, the entire world industry is affected. The world imports and exports are both going to be sloped. So there are extra effects that happen because of this. And I can go into more detail when I solve one of these problems. You guys had a problem like this in one of your assignments, and the solution is there too. Again, these separating between small and large countries is very important. Lastly, we got to think about the market structure. The market structure can either be perfectly competitive, which is basically standard, you have your supply and demand, but then there's also cases where it's in perfect competition. So when the structure is as a monopoly or as a duopoly, there are a few different things that you need to pay attention to. And in chapter 9, we learned about monopoly when it's at home, monopoly when it's foreign. These two examples are a little more particular, and they're a bit different than most of the other graphs in chapter 8, 9, 10, and 11. So they require extra attention. And then when we think about a duopoly, usually we got to think about strategic games and Nash equilibria, and that requires some learning in itself. Once you understand all these concepts clearly, you'll be able to answer all types of questions that are related to chapter 8, 9, 10, and 11. So here at the end, I'm going to skip all the way to the end and give you an idea of a couple questions. Here you can see a couple questions. What are the welfare effects of a tariff on imports in a small country? If home producers operate in a perfectly competitive industry. So here you got to realize that, hey, we're thinking about a tariff on imports in a small country, and it's a perfectly competitive industry. Then it also asks about a quota, and again, it asks you to use all graphs to illustrate and answer these questions. So questions like this, if I just change a couple of the words, like change the country from small to large, or I think about a monopoly producer now instead of perfectly competitive, the question becomes different, and the implications are different. And so you got to use the 4 principles in order to understand how to build it. Now, in order to clearly understand how those four principles are to be applied, I think I'm probably going to solve at least one, or maybe even, well, probably more than one, probably even 2 or 3 of these questions. There's 3 questions here, there's another 3 questions here, and it is important to note that I can create these kind of questions for basically most of the figures that you get to see in chapter 8 through 11. And now for the next couple minutes, I will go through some of these images, but very quickly. And as mentioned, once you guys let me know which are the questions that you guys want most, we're probably going to do a vote in the next class, in the class after, and you guys can choose some of the questions that I can do for you clearly. So here, I'm going to breeze through some of this stuff, but really highlight what's really important. So first key thing is understanding how to compute surplus. You really need to do this, because by doing this, you're actually going to be able to know what are the effects of different instruments, policy instruments that affect trade. And then you got to know how to build your home graph and your world graph. Here we have a simple home country with imports. That's why the price world is below the price at home. A small country, so exports are flat. Then you have a large country. Now exports and imports are both imports downward sloping, exports upward sloping. It's also important to understand how you derive these imports. Remember, imports is just the difference between supply and demand at home. And then if you go through all of them, you'll basically see how quotas work. Then we move to monopoly. Monopolies are a little different, so they do require extra attention. There's also a numerical exercise on dumping, infant industry protection, and then in chapter 10 we learn more about subsidies, small countries, large countries, tariffs, quotas, etc. And then we also look at the strategic games. So I will work on exercises for a lot more of these problems, but this set of slides gives you an idea of what you should focus on and where you should begin your study of the second half of the unit. Thank you so much.